Jake Morrison sat in the back row of the combat training hall, trying to make himself invisible. The 17-year-old from Colorado had been at the Galactic Combat Academy for 3 weeks now, and he still felt like a fish out of water around him. Alien cadets from dozens of different worlds chatted in their strange languages, their scales, feathers, and crystalline skin catching the artificial light. The training hall was massive, with high ceilings and walls lined with weapons from across the galaxy. Holographic displays showed combat techniques from different species, and the air hummed with the sound of translation devices working overtime. Jake pulled his standard-issue uniform jacket tighter around his shoulders and wished he was back home with his grandfather Pete. The heavy doors at the front of the hall slid open with a hiss, and Instructor Vexthal entered. The Draxian was 8 feet tall and covered in dark green scales that seemed to absorb light. His forearms moved with fluid grace, and his golden eyes swept the room like a predator sizing up prey. 2 rows of sharp teeth gleamed when he spoke, and his forked tongue constantly tasted the air. "Today we study the ancient combat arts," Vexthal announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall without any amplification. "These techniques were developed over thousands of years by the greatest warriors in galactic history." Jake watched as the instructor moved to the center of the room. Despite his size, Vexthal moved with surprising grace, his clawed feet making no sound on the polished floor. The other students leaned forward with interest, but Jake found himself thinking about the weekend camping trips he used to take with his grandfather back on Earth. "The technique I will demonstrate today is called the Spiral Death Strike," Vexthal continued, his forearms beginning to move in slow, precise patterns. It was perfected by the legendary Draxian masters who trained the Imperial Guard of Emperor Korthax the Conqueror. Jake's attention snapped back to the present as he watched the instructor's movements. The way Vexthal twisted his body, the angle of his arms, the precise footwork, it all looked familiar. Too familiar. The Spiral Death Strike combines joint manipulation with pressure point attacks. The instructor explained as he moved through the sequence. When performed correctly, it can disable opponents 3 times one's size. The technique requires perfect timing and understanding of anatomical weak points. The alien cadets watched in fascination as Vexthal demonstrated the full sequence. His movements were fluid and deadly, each motion flowing into the next like a violent dance. Jake felt his heart racing as memories flooded back, memories of his grandfather teaching him similar moves during their camping trips in the Colorado mountains. "This technique," Vexthal said, completing the demonstration, "was taught only to the most elite warriors in the Draxian Empire. No other species has ever mastered its intricacies. The mental discipline required is beyond the capacity of lesser beings." Jake felt his cheeks burn. He knew he should stay quiet, should keep his head down like he had been doing for weeks. But the movements were so similar to what his grandfather had taught him that he couldn't help himself. Slowly, he raised his hand. "Yes, human?" Vexthal's golden eyes fixed on him with obvious annoyance. "Actually, sir," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "my grandfather showed me something very similar to that. He said he learned it during his military service." The room fell completely silent. Even the constant hum of the translation devices seemed to quiet down. Jake could feel every alien eye in the room turning to look at him. Some of the cadets started to whisper among themselves. Vexthal's head tilted to one side, and his forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. "What did you say, human?" Jake felt his mouth go dry, but he pressed on. "My grandfather, Pete Mortison, he taught me moves like that. Not exactly the same, but really close. He said he learned them when he was in the army." "Impossible," Vexthal snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your primitive species could never comprehend such sophisticated combat arts. The Spiral Death Strike requires decades of training under Draxian masters. It demands mental discipline that humans simply do not possess. But sir, I can demonstrate the moves he taught me. They're really similar to what you just showed us." The laughter started quietly, just a few chuckles from the alien cadets. But it grew louder as more students joined in. Jake heard someone whisper, "Stupid human." In what sounded like the clicking language of the Zephyrian insect people, Vexthal's eyes narrowed to golden slits. "You dare to suggest that your grandfather, some primitive human soldier, learned techniques that took our greatest masters centuries to perfect?" "I'm not saying he learned them from your masters," Jake said, his voice getting stronger despite his fear. "I'm just saying the moves look similar. Maybe different species developed similar techniques independently." The laughter grew louder. Even some of the more serious alien cadets were smiling now. Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he continued talking. "My grandfather was really good at hand-to-hand combat. He taught me all kinds of things during our camping trips. Joint locks, pressure points, how to use an opponent's size against them. He said size didn't matter if you knew where to strike." Vexthal's massive frame seemed to swell with anger. His forearms flexed, and Jake could see the razor-sharp claws extending from his fingertips. "Lying about your betters will not be tolerated in my classroom, human whelp." "I'm not lying," Jake protested, standing up from his seat. "My grandfather really did teach me these things. He said he learned them during classified operations. He couldn't talk about most of what he did, but he wanted me to know how to defend myself." "Enough!" Vexthal roared, his voice echoing off the walls of the training hall. The instructor moved faster than Jake thought possible. One moment he was standing at the front of the room, the next he was looming over Jake's desk. Jake barely had time to flinch before Vexthal's scaled hand struck him across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Jake's head snapped to the side and he tasted blood in his mouth. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward, his chair clattering to the floor. "That," Vexthal hissed, "is what happens to humans who lie about their betters. You're nothing but a soft, weak creature from a backwater world. Your grandfather was nothing but a primitive soldier who probably learned a few basic moves from a training manual." Jake's cheek throbbed with pain, and he could feel it swelling already. Around him, the alien cadets were either laughing or looking away in embarrassment. Some seemed shocked by the instructor's violence, but none of them spoke up. "Report to Detention Block 7, Vexthal commanded, his voice returning to its normal volume. "Perhaps some time alone will teach you the proper respect for your instructors." Jake bent down to pick up his fallen chair, his hands shaking slightly. He could feel tears threatening to spill from his eyes, but he refused to cry in front of the alien cadets. Instead, he gathered his books and headed for the door as he walked through the hall. Jake could hear the whispers following him. Some of the comments were in languages he didn't understand, but he could guess what they were saying. The human had embarrassed himself. The human had been put in his place. The human was weak. Jake stumbled through the door and into the corridor. Beyond, his cheek burning and his pride shattered. Maybe the aliens were right. Maybe his grandfather had just been telling him stories to make him feel special. Maybe humans really were as primitive and weak as everyone said. He didn't notice the weathered human janitor in maintenance coveralls standing near the wall, watching him with keen interest. The man's name tag read Don Miller in his eyes. Followed Jake down the corridor with an expression that seemed far too knowing for a simple maintenance worker. Don Miller watched until Jake disappeared around the corner, then pulled out a small communication device and spoke quietly into it. "Control, this is Miller. We have a situation. Pete Morrison's grandson just revealed family knowledge in front of a Draxian instructor. I'm moving to intercept." The voice that responded was crisp and professional. "Understood, Miller. Authorization granted for limited disclosure. Protect the asset." Dan Miller pocketed the device and adjusted his tool belt. It was time to have a conversation with Jake Morrison. Time to tell him the truth about his grandfather and about what humans were really capable of when pushed too far. Jake sat alone in Detention Block 7, holding a cold compress against his swollen cheek. The room was small and gray, with nothing but a metal bench and a single light panel in the ceiling. His reflection stared back at him from the polished metal wall, showing a bruised face and defeated eyes. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, wondering if he should have kept his mouth shut. The other human cadets at the academy had warned him about speaking up in class. They told him to keep his head down, do his work, and try not to attract attention. But when he saw those moves so similar to what his grandfather had taught him, he couldn't help himself. Maybe they were right. Maybe his grandfather had just been making up stories to make a lonely kid feel special. Pete Morrison had raised Jake after his parents died in a mining accident when he was 8 years old. During their weekend camping trips in the Colorado mountains, Pete had taught him all kinds of things. How to start a fire without matches, how to track animals, how to find water in the wilderness, and yes, how to fight. But maybe the fighting techniques were just basic self-defense moves that Pete had learned from some old army manual. Maybe Jake had been fooling himself all these years, thinking his grandfather was some kind of special soldier. The way Instructor Vexthal had laughed at him made Jake feel like the biggest fool in the galaxy. The door to the detention room hissed open, and Jake looked up to see a human man in maintenance coveralls entering. He was middle-aged with graying hair and calloused hands, carrying a toolbox that looked like it had seen better days. His name tag read Don Miller in simple block letters. "Heard you had some trouble with Instructor Vexthal," Don said casually, setting his toolbox down near the wall panel. "Something about your grandfather?" Jake was surprised to see another human. The maintenance staff usually consisted of robot units or alien species that were considered too primitive for combat training. "You heard about that?" "Word travels fast in a place like this," Don replied, opening his toolbox and pulling out various tools. "Small community, especially among the humans." "So tell me about this grandfather of yours. What was his name?" "Pete Morrison," Jake said, his voice bitter. "He raised me after my parents died. Always told me stories about his time in the army, about special operations work. Said he couldn't talk about most of it because it was classified." Jake laughed harshly. "Probably all lies anyway. Just an old man trying to make himself sound important to his grandson." Dan's hands stopped moving on his tools. He looked up at Jake with sudden interest. "Pete Morrison, Army Special Forces. Served in some kind of classified program from 2157 to 2162. Jake's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "I never told anyone the dates." "Because I was there too," Don said quietly, setting down his tools and facing Jake directly. "My real name is Colonel Daniel Miller, retired. I served under your grandfather for 3 years. Kid, your grandfather wasn't just in special operations. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in human history." "That's impossible," Jake said, standing up from the bench. "If that's true, why are you working as a janitor on an alien space station?" Don smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. "Because someone needs to keep an eye on things here. Someone needs to make sure young humans don't get broken by alien instructors who think they know everything about combat. And someone needs to watch for signs that the old secrets might be coming out." Jake felt dizzy. What old secrets? "The kind of secrets that could change the balance of power in the galaxy," Don said. "The kind of secrets that your grandfather died protecting. The kind of secrets that got you slapped across the face today for mentioning them in public." Don moved to the door controls and pressed a sequence of buttons. The lock light changed from red to green, and Jake heard the magnetic seals disengage. "Come on, Jake. It's time you learned the truth about what your grandfather really did. And what humans are really capable of when they're pushed too far." Jake hesitated. "This is crazy." "You're just a maintenance worker. And I'm in detention. I can't just leave." "Kid, I outrank everyone on this station except maybe the director himself. Trust me when I say you're not in detention anymore." Dan picked up his toolbox and headed for the door. "But if you want to sit here feeling sorry for yourself instead of learning about your heritage, that's your choice." Jake looked around the empty detention room one more time, then hurried after Don. They walked through corridors that Jake had never seen before, past security checkpoints that opened automatically at Dan's approach. The older man moved with confidence, nodding to alien security guards who stepped aside respectfully. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, struggling to keep up with Dan's quick pace. "Somewhere we can talk without being overheard," Don replied. "Your grandfather made me promise to look out for you if anything ever happened to him." I've been watching you since you arrived at the academy, waiting to see if you'd inherited his instincts. They entered a maintenance tunnel that led deep into the station's lower levels. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits, and the air hummed with the sound of machinery. Don stopped at what looked like a regular maintenance panel, but when he pressed his palm against it, a hidden door slid open. "After you," Don said. Gesturing into the darkness beyond, Jake stepped through the doorway and found himself in a room that definitely wasn't supposed to exist. The walls were covered with screens showing star maps, combat footage, and what looked like classified military files. Computer terminals lined the walls, and in the center of the room was a holographic projector that could display three-dimensional images. "This is all illegal," Jake whispered, staring at the setup. "How did you build this without anyone noticing?" "Who says they haven't noticed?" Don replied, closing the door behind them. "The Academy Director knows I'm here. So does Galactic Command. They just don't know exactly what I'm doing, and they're smart enough not to ask too many questions." Don moved to one of the terminals and started typing commands. "Your grandfather didn't just serve in the military, Jake. He was part of humanity's first real contact with hostile alien forces. Not the diplomatic first contact that the history books talk about, but the kind of contact that happens when someone tries to wipe out your colonies." A holographic display activated, showing a younger version of Pete Morrison in military combat gear. He was leading a team of human soldiers against what looked like Draxian warriors, but these Draxians were different from the ones Jake had seen at the academy. These were wearing full battle armor and carrying weapons that could level buildings. In 2157, the Draxian Empire launched what they called a probe attack on our outer colonies, Don explained. They wanted to test human defenses, see how easy it would be to conquer us. They expected to roll over our settlements like they had done to a dozen other species. Jake watched in fascination as the hologram showed his grandfather moving through combat with fluid grace. The techniques were unmistakably the same ones that Pete had taught him during their camping trips, but seeing them used against alien warriors in real combat was completely different. Instead of easy conquest, they ran into Omega Team, Don continued. Your grandfather and 11 other soldiers held off an entire Draxian battle group for 6 weeks. They used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and combat techniques that the Draxians had never seen before. The hologram showed Pete Morrison performing what looked exactly like the spiral death strike that Instructor Vextal had demonstrated earlier. But Pete's version was faster, more efficient, adapted for human physiology in ways that made it deadlier than the original. The Draxians were so impressed with human fighting ability that they called off the invasion and sued for peace. Don said, but the peace treaty included some unusual clauses. One of them was that no human military personnel could reveal the true extent of our combat capabilities to the general galactic population. Jake felt his legs go weak. So the Omega program was covered up? Not covered up, Don corrected. Classified. Top secret. There are still Omega operatives throughout the galaxy, watching, waiting, protecting human interests. Like me, Don pulled up another file. This one showing a much younger version of himself in military uniform standing next to Pete Morrison. I was your grandfather's second-in-command during the Draxian conflict. After the program officially ended, I volunteered for this assignment. Someone had to monitor the academy, make sure incidents like today don't escalate into something bigger. Jake sank into a nearby chair, his mind struggling to process everything he was hearing. But why hide what we can do? Why let the aliens think we're weak? Because the galaxy isn't ready for the truth about humanity, Don said seriously. We're not the primitive species they think we are. We're something much more dangerous. We're adaptable. We take their techniques and improve them. We study their weaknesses and find ways to exploit them. If the major powers knew what humans were really capable of, they'd unite against us. The room suddenly shook, and red warning lights began flashing. On the walls, an alarm started blaring somewhere in the distance, and Jake could hear the sound of running footsteps in the corridors above. What's happening? Jake asked, jumping to his feet. Dan was already at his control panel, checking readings. That meant nothing to Jake. The alarms continued to blare as Dan worked frantically at his control panel. Jake watched the screens showing the approaching Draxian fleet, his heart pounding as he counted the enemy ships. 20 massive warships hung in space around the Academy. Like hungry predators circling their prey. How long before they attack? Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the warning sirens. They're not attacking yet, Don replied, studying the tactical display. They're positioning themselves for maximum psychological impact. Classic Draxian intimidation tactics. They want everyone on the station to see how hopeless the situation is before they make their demands. Through the walls, Jake could hear the sound of running feet and shouted orders in dozens of alien languages. The Academy was transforming from a peaceful training facility into a military fortress in minutes. Emergency blast doors were slamming shut, and defensive weapon systems were powering up. Why would they do this just because I mentioned my grandfather? Jake asked. Don pulled up another holographic display, this one showing detailed files on Draxian military commanders. Because your grandfather left quite an impression on them during the war. The Draxian military has never forgotten the human soldier who made their elite troops look like amateurs. The hologram showed a reptilian face that Jake recognized immediately. It was older and more scarred than the instructor he knew, but there was no mistaking those golden eyes and razor-sharp teeth. Admiral Kreshtar, Don said, pointing at the image. He was a young captain during the Omega conflict. Your grandfather personally defeated him in single combat during the Battle of Kepler Station. Kreshtar has been looking for a chance to restore his honor ever since. Jake stared at the image of the Draxian admiral. He looks like Instructor. Vexthal. That's because Vexthal is his younger brother, Don explained. The whole family has a grudge against humans in general and the Morrison family in particular. When Vexthal reported that Pete Morrison's grandson was at the Academy, claiming to know classified combat techniques, Kreshtar saw an opportunity. The main display screen changed to show the Academy's command center. Director Zolmuth, a tall crystalline being from the Vorthan Collective, was coordinating the defense with obvious desperation. His translucent blue skin was pulsing with stress patterns, and his multiple arms gestured frantically as he gave orders. We cannot hold them off for long, Zolmuth was saying to his staff. The Academy's shields were designed for training exercises, not full-scale military assault. The nearest Galactic Defense Force ships are 6 hours away. Don switched to another channel showing Instructor Vexthal in the Academy's weapons control room. The Draxian's earlier arrogance had been replaced by grim determination as he coordinated the defensive systems. The human cadets should be moved. To the emergency shelters, Vexthal was telling his assistants, my brother will target them first. He considers them the weakest link in our defenses. Jake felt anger rising in his chest. Even now, facing a full Draxian battle fleet, the aliens still thought of humans as helpless victims who needed to be protected. We have to do something, he said. We? Gon raised an eyebrow. You're 17 years old, and you've had exactly 3 weeks of basic academy training. But you said I'm Omega Legacy. You said my grandfather trained me. Dan studied Jake for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Your grandfather taught you self-defense moves during camping trips. That's not the same as being a trained soldier. Then train me, Jake said desperately. You have all this equipment, all these files. Show me what my grandfather really knew. Kid, it took your grandfather years to master these techniques. We have maybe an hour before the Draxians make their move. The main display suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Admiral Kreshtar's scarred face filled the screen, his golden eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. Attention Academy personnel, the Admiral's voice boomed through the station's speakers. I am Admiral Kreshtar of the Draxian Imperial Fleet. You are surrounded and outgunned. Your shields will not protect you from our weapons. Jake could see alien cadets and instructors throughout the station stopping to listen to the transmission. Fear was written on every face, regardless of species. However, Kreshtar continued, We have not come to destroy the Academy. We have come for one individual. Surrender the human known as Jake Morrison, grandson of the war criminal Pete Morrison, and the rest of you will be spared." The transmission ended, leaving the station in stunned silence. Jake felt like he had been punched in the stomach. An entire battle fleet had come for him specifically. 20 warships and thousands of soldiers, all because he had mentioned his grandfather's name in a classroom. "War criminal?" Jake whispered. "They called my grandfather a war criminal." "Winners write the history books," Don said grimly. "But that doesn't mean they tell the truth. Your grandfather was a hero who saved human colonies from being wiped out. The Draxians call him a war criminal because he embarrassed their military and forced them to sign a peace treaty." Dan moved to a different control panel and began typing rapidly. "But this changes things. If Kreshtar is willing to risk a galactic incident just to get his hands on you, then he must believe you know something important, something worth starting a war over." "But I don't know anything," Jake protested. "I'm just a kid who learned some fighting moves from his grandfather." "Maybe that's enough," Don said. He pulled up a new holographic display, this one showing detailed combat footage from the Omega program. "Jake, I'm going to show you something that's been classified for over 60 years. This is what your grandfather really did during the war." The hologram showed Pete Morrison in his prime, wearing advanced combat armor and carrying weapons that Jake had never seen before. But it wasn't the equipment that caught Jake's attention. It was the way his grandfather moved, the fluid grace and deadly precision that made every motion look like a work of art. "The spiral death strike that Vextel demonstrated today," Don explained. "Your grandfather learned it by fighting Draxian masters in real combat, but he didn't just copy their technique. He analyzed it, broke it down, and rebuilt it to work better for human physiology." The hologram showed Pete Morrison facing off against a Draxian warrior twice his size. The alien had all the advantages: greater strength, natural armor, razor-sharp claws, and centuries of training. But Pete moved like water, flowing around the Draxians' attacks and striking with surgical precision at weak points in the alien's natural armor. "Your grandfather discovered something that the Draxians never expected," Don continued. "Humans don't just adapt to other species' fighting styles. We improve them, we make them faster, more efficient, more deadly. That's what makes us dangerous." Jake watched in fascination as the combat footage showed his grandfather using techniques that looked familiar yet completely foreign. These were the moves Pete had taught him during their camping trips, but refined and perfected through years of real combat experience. "The Draxians developed the spiral death strike over thousands of years," Don explained. "Your grandfather mastered it in 6 months and then created 17 different variations that were more effective than the original." Another hologram appeared, showing Pete Morrison training with other human soldiers. Jake recognized some of the techniques immediately: joint locks, pressure point strikes, and grappling moves that his grandfather had taught him. But seeing them performed by trained soldiers in full combat gear was completely different from practicing them in the Colorado mountains. "The Omega program wasn't just about fighting the Draxians," Don said. "It was about proving that humans could stand toe-to-toe with any species in the galaxy. Your grandfather and his team didn't just win battles, they revolutionized the way combat is fought." The station shook again as the Draxian fleet adjusted their positions. Through the displays, Jake could see panic spreading through the academy as students and instructors realized how hopeless their situation was. "So what do we do now?" Jake asked. Don closed the holographic displays and turned to face him directly. "Now you have a choice to make. You can hide in the emergency shelters with the other human cadets and hope the Draxians keep their word about sparing everyone else. Or you can let me show you what it really means to carry the Morrison name." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about activating the emergency protocols your grandfather put in place," Don said. "I'm talking about showing Admiral Kreshtar that Pete Morrison's legacy is alive and well. I'm talking about reminding the galaxy why the Draxian Empire sued for peace all those years ago." Jake felt something stirring inside him, something that had been sleeping since his grandfather's death. It was the same feeling he got during their camping trips when Pete would tell him stories about standing up to bullies, about protecting the innocent, about never backing down when you're in the right. "Show me," Jake said quietly. Dan smiled. "For the first time since the crisis began. That's what I wanted to hear. But understand this, kid, once we start down this path, there's no going back. The galaxy will never see humans the same way again." "Good," Jake said, thinking about the laughter in the classroom, about Vexthol's dismissive slap, about 20 enemy warships demanding his surrender. Maybe it's time they learned the truth. Don opened the weapons locker with a series of biometric scans that Jake didn't even see him perform. Inside was equipment that looked nothing like the standard Academy gear. The armor was sleek and black, designed for human anatomy with enhanced joint flexibility. The weapons were compact but deadly-looking, clearly built for speed and precision rather than raw power. "This is Omega gear," Don explained, pulling out a suit sized for someone Jake's age. "Your grandfather requested that we keep a set here, just in case." He said Morrison men had a habit of finding trouble wherever they went. Jake ran his fingers over the armor's surface. It felt warm to the touch and seemed to adjust slightly to fit his hand. "How did he know I'd need this?" "Because he knew his grandson," Don replied, helping Jake into the armor. "Pete always said you had the Morrison instincts. He saw it in the way you moved, the way you watched people, the way you never backed down from a fight even when you were outmatched." The armor fit perfectly, adjusting automatically to Jake's body measurements. Heads-up displays activated in the helmet, showing tactical information that Jake didn't understand yet. The weight was distributed so well that he felt like he was wearing regular clothes. "The Academy's defensive systems are failing," Don said, monitoring his screens. "Kreshtar is being patient, letting the fear build. He wants everyone to see how helpless they are before he makes his final demands." Through the displays, Jake could see chaos spreading through the station. Alien cadets huddled in emergency shelters while instructors tried to maintain order. The Academy's weapons were powering up, but everyone knew they wouldn't last long against a full Draxian battle fleet. "In 5 minutes, Kreshtar is going to give Director Zilmuth an ultimatum," Dan continued. "Surrender Jake Morrison or watch the Academy burn. Zilmuth will have no choice but to comply." "Unless we give him another option," Jake said, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. Dan nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like your grandfather. But understand what we're up against. Admiral Kreshtar has spent 60 years planning his revenge. He's brought enough firepower to level this entire station." The main display switched to show the Draxian flagship, a massive vessel bristling with weapons. Jake could see smaller ships launching from its docking bays, assault shuttles filled with Draxian soldiers preparing for boarding operations. "The plan is simple," Don explained. "Kreshtar wants to capture you alive so he can parade you in front of the Draxian Empire as proof that humans are weak. He'll send boarding parties to take the Academy piece by piece, driving everyone toward the main docking bay where his troops will be waiting." "So we let them come?" "We let them think they're winning," Don corrected. "Your grandfather taught me that the best time to strike is when your enemy believes they've already won. Overconfidence makes people sloppy." Dan handed Jake a small communication device. "This will let us stay in contact even if we get separated. It's encrypted with Omega protocols, so the Draxians won't be able to intercept our transmissions." The station shook violently as the first Draxian assault shuttles docked with the Academy's outer hull. Through the security cameras, Jake could see armored Draxian soldiers cutting through blast doors with energy weapons. Each soldier stood over 8 feet tall, their natural scales enhanced with additional armor plating. "They're coming in through Docking Bay 7, Don observed. "Just like your grandfather predicted they would. Draxians always use the same tactical approaches, overwhelming force applied to the weakest point." The Academy's defenders opened fire as the first Draxian soldiers emerged from their shuttles. But the aliens' armor was too strong for the Academy's training weapons. Within minutes, the defenders were falling back toward the main corridors. Director Zolmuth is calling for a general retreat to the emergency shelters, Don reported. He's trying to minimize casualties before the inevitable surrender. Jake watched the tactical displays as red dots representing Draxian forces spread through the academy like an infection. The aliens were moving with professional efficiency, securing each section before advancing to the next. It was clear they had done this many times before. There, Don pointed to a group of signals moving separately from the main force. That's Kreshtar's personal guard. He's coming aboard himself to oversee your capture. The Admiral wants to look you in the eye. When he proves that humans are inferior, how many guards does he have? 12 elite soldiers plus Kreshtar himself, all veterans of dozens of campaigns. These aren't Academy instructors, Jake. These are professional killers who have been fighting wars since before you were born. Jake felt fear trying to creep into his mind, but he pushed it away. His grandfather had faced worse odds during the Omega operations. Pete Morrison had gone up against entire Draxian battle groups with just 11 other humans and emerged victorious. What would my grandfather do? Jake asked. Don smiled grimly. He'd turn their strength against them? Draxians are powerful, but they're also predictable. They rely on intimidation and overwhelming force because it usually works. They've never had to adapt to an enemy who fights back with intelligence instead of brute strength. The communication system crackled to life with Director Zolmuth's voice. All personnel, this is Director Zolmuth. I am ordering a complete evacuation to the emergency shelters. Do not attempt to resist the Draxian forces. This is not a training exercise. Time to go, Don said, checking his own armor systems. Kreshtar will be heading for the command center to demand your location. We need to be there waiting for him. They moved through the maintenance tunnels with practiced stealth, avoiding the main corridors where Draxian soldiers were advancing. Jake was amazed at how quietly the Omega armor allowed him to move. His footsteps made no sound, and the armor seemed to absorb even the sound of his breathing. Remember your grandfather's lessons, Don whispered as they approached the command center. Size doesn't matter if you know where to strike. Speed defeats strength. And most importantly, never fight fair when lives are at stake. Through a security camera, they could see Kreshtar and his guards entering the command center. The Admiral was even more imposing in person than he had been on the communication screen. His scales were dark with age and covered in ritual scars, and his forearms moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime warrior. Director Zolmuth stood before the Draxian Admiral, his crystalline body pulsing with fear patterns. Admiral Kreshtar, the Academy is a neutral facility protected by galactic law. Your attack violates silence, Kreshtar interrupted, his voice like grinding stone. Galactic law does not protect war criminals and their offspring. You will surrender the human known as Jake Morrison immediately, or I will order my fleet to reduce this station to debris. The human you seek is not here, Zolmuth lied desperately. He was evacuated with the other cadets when your ships arrived. Kreshtar's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Do not insult my intelligence, Director. My sensors show exactly 2 humans remaining on this station. One is an elderly maintenance worker who poses no threat. The other is the Morrison boy. One of Kreshtar's guards stepped forward, consulting a handheld scanner. Admiral, I'm detecting human life signs in the maintenance levels below the command center. 2 individuals moving toward this location. Perfect, Kreshtar said, his golden eyes gleaming with anticipation. Set up a perimeter. When they arrive, I want them taken alive. I have plans for Pete Morrison's grandson that require his continued breathing. Don looked at Jake through their helmet displays. This is it, kid. Once we step into that room, there's no going back. Are you ready to show the galaxy what a Morrison can do? Jake thought about his grandfather's stories, about the camping trips where Pete had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. He thought about the laughter in the classroom, about Vextal's dismissive slap, about 20 warships full of aliens who thought humans were weak and helpless. I'm ready, Jake said quietly. They moved toward the command center. 2 humans in advanced armor against 13 of the galaxy's most elite warriors. The odds were impossible. But Jake found himself thinking about something his grandfather used to say during their camping trips. "Morrison men don't retreat," Pete had told him. "We adapt, we overcome, and we never give up. That's what makes us dangerous." Jake Morrison was about to find out just how dangerous a human could be when pushed too far. And Admiral Kreshtar was about to learn why the Draxian Empire had sued for peace all those years ago. The battle for the Academy was about to begin, and this time the humans weren't planning to lose. Jake and Dan emerged from the maintenance tunnel into the corridor leading to the command center. Through the reinforced windows, they could see Admiral Kreshtar's guards taking positions around Director Zolmoth. The crystalline being was trembling. With fear, his blue skin pulsing in rapid distress patterns. "Remember," Don whispered into his helmet communicator, "Draxians have excellent hearing but poor peripheral vision. Their natural armor is strongest on the chest and back, weakest at the joints. And their pride makes them predictable." Jake nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the impossible odds they faced. The Omega armor made him feel connected to his grandfather in a way he had never experienced before. It was as if Pete Morrison was standing beside him, guiding his movements. "Admiral Kreshtar," Jake called out as they approached the command center entrance. "I'm Jake Morrison. I believe you wanted to see me." The effect was immediate. Every Draxian in the room turned toward the sound of his voice, their weapons raising in unison. Admiral Kreshtar's golden eyes widened with surprise and then narrowed with satisfaction. "So," the Admiral hissed, "Pete Morrison's grandson finally shows himself. I was beginning to think you were as much of a coward as your grandfather." Jake stepped through the doorway, Don close behind him. The 12 Draxian guards formed a circle around them, energy weapons trained on their hearts. At close range, Jake could see the ritual scars covering each soldier's scales, marking them as elite warriors who had survived countless battles. "My grandfather wasn't a coward," Jake said quietly. "He was the soldier who made your entire empire sue for peace." Kreshtar's laugh was like the sound of breaking stone. "Your grandfather was a terrorist who used dishonorable tactics against superior opponents. He hid in shadows and struck from ambush like a common assassin. He adapted to survive," Dan interjected. "Something Draxians have never been good at." "Ah, the maintenance worker speaks." Kreshtar turned his attention to Dan. "You must be one of the other Omega survivors. I wondered when you would show yourselves." The Admiral gestured to his guards who tightened their circle around the two. "Humans, 60 years I have waited for this moment. 60 years since your grandfather humiliated me in front of the entire Draxian fleet. Today, I will restore my honor by proving that humans are nothing more than clever animals." "You're welcome to try," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear racing through his veins. Kreshtar's eyes gleamed with predatory anticipation. "Guards, take them alive. I want to study their techniques before I execute them publicly." The first Draxian moved with lightning speed, lunging toward Jake with claws extended. But Jake was already moving, his grandfather's training taking over completely. He sidestepped the attack and struck at the pressure point behind the alien's knee joint, sending the massive warrior crashing to the floor. The other guards hesitated for a split second, shocked by how easily their comrade had been defeated. That hesitation was all Don needed. The older man moved like a ghost, his movements so fluid they seemed impossible. 2 more Draxians fell before they could react. "Impossible," Kreshtar breathed, watching his elite guards struggle against 2 humans in ways they had never experienced before. Jake found himself moving with confidence he didn't know he possessed. The spiral death strike that Instructor Vexthal had demonstrated in class became a weapon in his hands, modified and improved just as his grandfather had taught him. He flowed around the Draxians' attacks like water, striking at weak points with surgical precision. "Your grandfather taught you well," Don called out as he disabled another guard with a move that looked almost like a dance. "But let me show you something he learned during the war." Dan's next series of movements were so fast that Jake could barely follow them. 3 Draxian guards found themselves on the floor, conscious but completely unable to move. Dawn had struck. Nerve clusters that temporarily paralyzed their motor functions without causing permanent damage. "This is impossible," one of the fallen guards gasped. "Humans cannot move like this. You are too small, too weak." "That's what your people never understood," Jake said, helping Dan corner the remaining guards. "We don't rely on size and strength. We use intelligence, adaptability, and technique." Admiral Kreshtar drew his own weapon, a massive energy sword that crackled with deadly power. "Enough! I will kill you both myself and prove that Draxian honor cannot be defeated by human trickery." The Admiral was faster than his guards, his movements honed by decades of combat experience. His energy sword swept through the air where Jake had been standing, leaving scorch marks on the metal floor, but Jake wasn't there anymore. He had learned from his grandfather that the best defense was to never be where your enemy expected you to be. "Stand still and fight like a warrior," Kreshtar roared, frustrated by Jake's constant movement. "Why?" Jake asked, ducking under another sword swing. "This is working much better." Don moved to flank the Admiral, forcing Kreshtar to divide his attention between 2 opponents. The older man's movements were economical and precise, each action serving multiple purposes. When Kreshtar turned to face him, Dan was already somewhere else. "You see, Admiral," Don said conversationally as he avoided another attack, "your people made a fundamental mistake about humans. You thought we were just another species to be conquered. But we're not." Jake saw his opening as Kreshtar overextended, himself trying to strike down, moving with the fluid grace his grandfather had taught him. Jake slipped inside the Admiral's guard and struck at the nerve cluster controlling his right arms. The massive alien sword clattered to the floor as his right side went numb. "We're something much more dangerous," Jake continued, backing away as Kreshtar tried to grab him with his remaining functional arms. "We're adaptable. We learn from every enemy we face and we never make the same mistake twice." Kreshtar stumbled, his balance thrown off by the partial paralysis. "This cannot be happening. I am Admiral Kreshtar of the Draxian Imperial Fleet. I have conquered dozens of worlds." "And my grandfather was Pete Morrison of Earth's Omega program," Jake replied. "He taught me that titles don't matter in a fight, only results matter." With a final movement that looked almost gentle, Jake struck the pressure point at the base of Kreshtar's skull. The massive Admiral's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor unconscious but unharmed. The command center fell silent except for the groans of defeated Draxian soldiers. Director Zolmov stared at the scene in complete shock, his crystalline body flickering with confusion patterns. "How?" the director whispered. "How did 2 humans defeat 13 elite Draxian warriors?" "The same way we've been defeating superior enemies for thousands of years," Don replied, checking on the fallen guards. "We think, we adapt, and we never give up." Jake's helmet communicator crackled to life with transmissions from the Draxian fleet. The other ships had detected that their admiral was down, and confusion was spreading through their ranks. "This is Captain Vorthak of the battle cruiser Vengeance," a voice said over the open channel. "Admiral Kreshtar, please respond. We are reading unknown energy signatures from the Academy." Don gestured for Jake to respond. "This is Jake Morrison," Jake said into the communicator. "Your admiral is alive but unconscious. His guards are also alive but defeated. You have 2 choices. You can retreat now with your honor intact, or you can try to avenge him and learn what my grandfather really taught me." The silence stretched for long minutes before Captain Vorthak responded. "The fleet acknowledges your victory, Jake Morrison. We will retrieve our personnel and withdraw. The Draxian Empire remembers the lessons of the Omega program." As the Draxian ships began pulling back from the Academy, Jake helped Dan secure the unconscious guards. Around them, Academy personnel slowly emerged from the emergency shelters. Staring in amazement at the 2 humans who had saved them all, Instructor Vexthal was among the first to enter the command center. The Draxian instructor looked at his unconscious brother, then at Jake, then back at his brother. His golden eyes showed a mixture of emotions that Jake couldn't quite read. "Jake Morrison," Vexthal said formally, I owe you an apology that cannot be expressed in words. Your grandfather's legacy is not just formidable, it is legendary. Jake pulled off his helmet, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He always told me that the measure of a person isn't their strength, but what they do with it. Don clapped Jake on the shoulder. Your grandfather would be proud, kid. You've honored the Morrison name and reminded the galaxy why humans are not to be underestimated. As the crisis ended and the academy began returning to normal, Jake realized that everything had changed. The other cadets looked at him with new respect, and the instructor spoke to him as an equal rather than a primitive species to be tolerated. But more importantly, Jake had finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. During all those camping trips, Pete Morrison hadn't just been showing him how to fight. He had been teaching him how to be human in a galaxy that didn't understand what that really meant. The galaxy might think humans were weak, but Jake Morrison now knew the truth. They weren't weak at all. They were something far more dangerous than any alien species had ever imagined. They were human, and that made all the difference in the universe.